Welcome to Not Your Typical Church Ladies, faith conversations for your real life. I'm Vicky, and each week I'm joined with my fellow workers in the vineyard, Anne and Karen, to break open the Sunday scriptures and talk about life and faith and everything in between. Join your Not Typical Church Ladies on this journey each week. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Your Not So Typical Church Ladies are here for week 2 of Lent. And I'm so excited to hear what you guys thought about these readings. We kind of have these highs and lows in these readings when you look at them, because as we've told you all before, this Lent, we're in year B and we are going deep. And we have a lot, I think, of things to talk about. So how are you guys? Any our first thoughts overall, or if you want to get into the first reading, we can do that.
Okay. Let's just talk about, we're talking about taking Lent one day at a time. Let's talk about how not excited I am about this first reading.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody, this is the sacrifice of Isaac. It's Abraham and Isaac going up to the mountain. Somebody else start this up one off.
I can't. Okay. So I'm thinking, as an aunt and as a mom and as somebody who works with kids, I don't know if I could have done it as far as Abraham got.
No way.
I trust God. I love God. God is in my life all the time. I don't know if I would have been able to get as far as Abraham got. So that's how I'm stuck with that. That's where I always am, stuck with this.
No, and you can I don't want to say make the excuse, but it feels like an excuse that well, back in that culture and in that time, they didn't think about children the same way we think about children. Really? Didn't they know? And they were more like property than because I mean, you would throw yourself on that fire before allowing your child to be placed there.
Right.
So every time this reading comes out, I'm just people will make points about, well, we have to be whatever God wants, you need to be willing to sacrifice. But I just feel like when it comes to your kids,
yeah,
this one is a hard one to get anything out of for me.
Yeah. So just everyone knows we record these prior to the weeks, and I think this one hit home a little more this week, just because of the last 2 weeks of the deaths in our communities.
Right.
Young children.
We buried several young people out of our two faith communities in the last few weeks. And so as people who work at the church and who especially walk with Father Rob as he's doing all these funerals, there's a heaviness, there's a sadness. One of the young people who died was very close to me personally, and I'm just not in the mood for this reading right now.
Yeah.
Just, not in the mood. I'm not in the mood. And I get what yes, we all make sacrifices, and yes, maybe it's just maybe I just need to start thinking about it in terms of less from sacrificing my own child and more just things are hard. Tragedies happen in all of our lives at one point or another to different extents for different people. And the idea was that Abraham was obedient, but doesn't the word obey mean to listen?
Yeah.
So maybe it's not to just give myself permission not to think of that God wanted this young person's death. Because if I go there, I'm
yeah, no.
But that when the loss happens, how do I listen?
Yeah.
How do I listen to God from within the loss? And I'm not sure that's helpful for someone who's in it. So I just feel like being really gentle and cautious with what we say when you're talking about the loss of a child. Yeah. Because any parent can't really make this an abstract reading. is my
Right.
thought.
Yeah, no, and a lot of the times we say, well, it's just a story. It's just an analogy of what we're supposed to do. But sometimes, in our lives, things happen and it's going to hit us. We're going to hear this story again next year
Mhm.
and or in 3 years, whenever it comes up next. But it's like, we're going to be totally different people in, 3 years. But I think we need to give ourselves permission to not be okay
Mhm.
and to struggle with things. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to understand our relationship with God. And it is okay to be angry with God right now, and struggle with everything that's been going on. But the idea of, like what you said, Anne, like, what are we hearing versus what are we listening to? And I think that that's always a distinction too, like, do you really hear what I'm saying or are you listening to what I'm saying? And I don't know, it's hard. We want to be gentle, in any way, shape, or form with this, and not to be, that literal, but in a sense of like, where can we move ourselves, in the uncomfortable, to find out what God is calling us to do.
Yeah. There was one line that I kind of was holding on to a little bit, so after when God saves Isaac, um, he says that he's going to bless Abraham abundantly, and in his descendants, all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. So I think whenever a terrible thing happens, or whenever we're in that spot, um, I don't believe that God wants our suffering, but I do believe that God, can bring us out of the suffering into something that is a blessing.
Yeah.
Like the distinction there. And the idea that it wasn't just a blessing for Abraham, but it was a blessing for all the nations. Like the blessing God was giving Abraham was for everybody. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's just kind of like there's a bigger picture and things unfold in ways that we maybe couldn't anticipate or plan or expect. Yeah.
Yeah. As a side note, everybody, we postponed the first recording of this because we just we just couldn't deal with it right then. And we're still struggling with it.
So the one thing that, so before we were supposed to do the first recording, I had spiritual direction, and I was talking to my spiritual director about this because, it hits home in so many ways. And one of the things she said was she had seen a movie depiction of this. And in it, like, it's what you don't hear in the scripture, right? So like, what did Abraham say to Isaac? Like, what was that? And in the movie, it shows them talking about, and Isaac being the one that's saying, if this is what has to be done, then I will accept, what God has asked of you. And I think, like, that is what keeps playing in my head. Like, what was that reconciling between father and son like at the end of all of this? And, of, and I love that picture of them almost in it together. That's the only thing that has helped me in the last week looking at this reading, was this idea of what was, like, when did he know and what? Or, like, I think the other thing that stood out to me is, if there wasn't that conversation, the pain that Abraham had in holding it to himself, and how sometimes when something is so horrible, you don't even have words for it, and he couldn't even probably articulate it fully. I think we've all been in those places, right? Not in that situation, but in those places where sometimes things are so hard, it's almost like you're in the silence and dealing with it. and then the only person you have is God to try to reconcile it. But so hard first reading, and then
Yeah.
go into the second reading, which is very short, which is just kind of that reminder of what we walk during Holy Week, the idea of that God, that he did not spare his own son, that God gave up his son for us, which is, I think, the reason the first week reading's really chosen in my mind is that balance of, what ultimately happened. Any thoughts?
Well, that connection of God sacrificing Jesus, connection with Abraham and Isaac, it was almost, God wasn't asking Abraham something that God wouldn't have or did himself, so like that kind of, I don't know if it was comforting, like, it was like, thank God that Jesus did what he did, but it's still like, I still struggle with Jesus sacrificing himself for us. And in that, the transfiguration, like Jesus told the disciples, like, stay quiet until it actually happens, instead of going out and being like, hey, this is true. And it's like, I don't know about you ladies, but I have a hard time keeping good news to myself. I mean, I'm sure you guys know that because
I've heard him keep bad news to myself too. Yeah.
Because every time something happens, I'm like, Aunt Vicky, oh my gosh. Like, I'm glad I wasn't on the mountain for that, because I'd be like, oh,
Oh, yeah.
Like, oh my
Can you
gosh.
imagine Jesus bringing the church ladies up and then saying, like, don't tell anybody. Don't put it on the podcast.
We probably would have got more stuff done. But anyway, it's just that idea. We talked about it last year. That coming down from the mountain, they had this experience, this like aha moment to come down and like snap back into reality of like, oh, I'm not supposed to share this. I'm supposed to just keep quiet until it actually happens. And how many times have we had that aha moment or that mountaintop moment? I know I have on retreats, and then you come home and it's like, oh, like I want to go back. I want to be with the people that like knew what I was feeling and felt the same way. And, I'm thinking about NCYC, like I want to celebrate Mass with 20,000 people again and have it be absolutely quiet for adoration with 20,000 people.
Me too, sister.
So I don't know where I was going with that either, like connecting with the sacrificing and then the mountaintops, but like we have to sacrifice ourselves when we're on that mountain and on that high.
Yeah.
To then bring it back. I don't know. Second one, like.
I know. Well, the second reading, I'm just going to bring it back to the second reading for a minute. It says, if God is for us, who can be against us? But then it goes on to talk about, yeah. So it's because I spent time with a mom this week whose son had been taken from her by violence. And this is a very faithful family. And it just but questioning, like, how could a loving God allow this? And I think for many of us, the idea that God sacrificed his son and paralleling that with like Abraham sacrificing Isaac, that doesn't feel like a loving God. Okay, so what are we missing? Because when this young man died, I believe that God was holding him, but I don't think God took him. God didn't take him, right? Somebody else took him. And it wasn't what God would have wanted. So, but I believe that God is holding this mother the same way he is holding her son. And Yeah. I mean, like the mountains that we climb in our lives, like we talk about that transfiguration reading, like it's a high point,
Right.
but really it was a challenge for them. First of all, just the idea of climbing a mountain is exhausting, right? Like you have to work to get up a mountain. You have to plan to get up a mountain. You have to, taking teenagers to NCYC takes a lot of work, a lot of planning, and there's lots of details. And lots of things can go wrong and often do. And so yes, the mountain gave memories, but first of all, they didn't really understand it. Second of all, they couldn't really share it with other people yet.
Right.
But it transformed them. I don't know. And I feel like a promise was made on both these mountains in the first reading and the gospel reading. God promises to Abraham the blessings that are going to come. And in, a lot of ways, the transfiguration was a promise of who Jesus was, that was yet to be fulfilled. Like we're talking about all yet Lent, promises yet to be fulfilled, taking things one day at a time. So I don't know. Yeah.
I know.
That's what I got.
One of the things that, while you were talking straight up to me, right, is that what they get on the mountain isn't fulfilled for such a long time, right? Like Peter doesn't truly come into why he was there until later on, after denying, after all the things he goes through. And the hardest thing is you have to come down from the mountain. That's the one thing, always sticks out to me in this reading. You have to come down from the mountain and deal with reality and deal with a non-perfect world that we live in. And yeah, in that second reading, the idea of that God is always with us, it's easy on the high points. It's easy in in those high points. It's harder when you're in the muck of reality and of sin, of the fact that we're imperfect and horrible things happen in this world that make no sense whatsoever. And in that, what do we have to hold on to? For me, it's always been that in the suffering of Jesus, we can tie our suffering. Or sometimes for me, it's even the suffering of Mary more than Jesus, of having to watch the painful things happen and be helpless in them sometimes, to not be able to intervene or stop them. And so I think for me, sometimes the transfiguration is that reminder of you have to get off the mountain and there's more work to be done, and you might not see the conclusion of that work for years. So all you have to hold on to is those memories of what God has spoken to you. Like Abraham had to hold on to that promise of God that he gave on that mountain, that this would be fulfilled and he would have this great impact on the world. Just like Peter, James, and John had to hold on to the fact that what they saw was important enough that it would be shared at some point.
I mean, maybe that's just the point, is that like we're all called to discipleship, to be followers of Jesus, to seek God, to draw close to God. But God doesn't promise us that it's going to be easy. He promises that he's going to be with us in it. Like we're not promised sunshine and roses, but like there's joy in the walk, but there's also a lot of sorrow, and we just need to be there for each other in it. I mean, that's why I feel like church is important in my life, because it's that community that can carry you when you can't carry yourself, when you can't get yourself up the mountain. You have a crew, and you have a crew that has a purpose. And yeah, so that's for me, like if God is for us, who can be against us? It's like the us that's important, right? Like yeah. And there just aren't a whole lot of places, I feel like, in modern society these days that can do that. Where people can be in relationship with people who are different ages, different, opinions, or personalities or anything. We all got to be in it together, right? It's not about the clique that happens on the mountain. It's about what happens when we go out.
Yeah. And our society doesn't help us with that. I mean, we have this culture war of us versus them
Mhm.
in like everything, religion, politics, gender, race, like everything. Whereas in our faith, in our communities, we hold that. We are able to not have that us versus them because of our belief in Christ and our discipleship. Even though, I mean, we are divided in the church as well, but I think, I find comfort in knowing that even though society is speculating that it's an us versus them to gain attraction in other areas, how can we as disciples of Jesus overcome that us versus them and be that inclusive where we can uphold or hold everybody up regardless of race, gender, belief, politic view, whatever. I mean, how boring would it be if we were all the same?
Yeah.
But yeah, having a community to lift us up. We joke between the three of us, like the three of us can't all have a bad day. One of us has to at least have a good day, right? And I think that that's kind of similar in church, right? I mean, there's always going to be somebody who has a good day that can hold us and hold our hand and walk us along.
And if anything, these difficult funerals we've had these last weeks have shown that, like, what can happen when a community is a blessing for you.
Yeah.
In the high points and the low points, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the low points.
Yeah.
And
to continue that community after the event.
Right.
I think that is also sometimes difficult, is that everyone is heightenedly aware of what people need at that specific time. It's going to be the next couple of months or years that are going to be the most important in all of our lives in whatever event we have. I mean, speaking from personal view, we had a tragic in our family. It'll be, oh my gosh, 11 years ago. But our family is still connected by that and still lifts each other up.
Remember that.
That's also important too, that we don't remember just the day or the event, but in years to come or months, to continue that support. Just like the disciples had, like Vicky was saying, it took months and years before the actual event of Jesus's death happened, but the disciples were all still there together. Well, not knowing what we were going to talk about, I think we did a pretty good job.
And
well, for me, I think week 2 of Lent, with everything we've had going on, is that reminder. Sometimes we have more questions than answers.
Yeah.
And that's part of prayer, and that's just part of the journey, is having those questions and wrestling with them, because they're okay to have, and it's okay to feel confused sometimes by what we're presented with.
So let us know if you guys need us to hold you in prayer, and we ask that you continue to hold us in prayer as well.
One day at a time.
Yeah.
We can do
1 minute at a time lately.
Well, with that, any final thoughts before we allow everyone to wrestle with their own questions?
I think just for me, it would be another way of looking at the transfiguration is like, well, Jesus took 3 friends to a special place where he revealed himself to them in a special way. So I don't know, how can we let God bring us away to a place where we can see him, where we can see what he's trying to show us? Yeah, I'm just going to throw that out there as a question for everybody to think about this week, because sometimes you just need to take a break and change your perspective and give God some space to move so he can show you his heart.
I think for me, not all of our God moments are going to be as loud as the transfiguration. Sometimes it's going to be in the quiet. And, during Advent, we said our prayerful sleeping and resting.
Really napping.
Holy napping. Yeah. We just need to still ourselves in the moments of chaos and loudness and try to, not actually, just don't try anything. Just be in the quiet and just wait and see what happens. I'm gonna take my own advice too. So.
All right, ladies. Well, as always, it's a pleasure to talk and wrestle and work through our readings in this journey of Lent that we're going one day at a time with. And we will be back next week for the 3rd week of Lent. Like I said, we are in this with you all. So we hope you come back next week to join us for the next reflections by us. Bye.
Good week, everybody.
Bye.
On behalf of Anne, Karen, and myself, thank you again for listening to this episode of Faith Conversations for Your Real Life. Please make sure to subscribe to wherever you're listening or watching this episode. You can find the readings linked in the description box below, and we can't wait to see you again next time on Faith Conversations for Your Real Life with your favorite not so typical church ladies.